We all know that philanthropic capital is finite. Public sector capital is limited. So unless we bring in the private sector in a meaningful way, we're not going to get anywhere close to achieving our big, ambitious goals here.
Good day and welcome to another episode of Connecting the Dots. Today, I have the pleasure of having Mrs. Ije Okeke, MD of the Global South and Catalytic Finance for the Rocky Mountain Institute. Ije, how are you?
I'm great, thank you. How are you?
I'm well.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a big fan of the work that Next Year does across the sector. So thank you for the invitation.
Thank you also for joining. I think in pre-production, I got to remember that you started this journey at Geometric Power almost 2 decades ago.
Most
You probably started when you were 12. So, but you've really watched the sector go through different phases, and energy transition is the new phase that we're in. But energy transition has its challenges because of the financial gap that's required to really get us there. So, what do we do about that in this Nigerian power market?
No, thanks for the opening question. I think first of all, when in the context of talking about energy in sub-Saharan Africa and in Nigeria, I try not to focus on energy transition because I feel as a country, as a continent, we're living in a state of energy poverty. So we need more energy. We need energy abundance. And from our perspective, we want to make sure that the people of Nigeria are looking at not just fossil fuel alternatives, but looking at decarbonized clean energy alternatives to meeting that energy need. And we are fortunate that Nigeria is blessed with so many resources, and we need to make sure we are exploiting clean energy, both hydro, solar, and battery, as we look at ways of meeting our energy needs.
Speaking of exploring natural resources that we already have, the conversation for solar, of large scale solar, has been around for a while now. From your experience working in the space, why hasn't that taken off yet, given the advantages of no cost for or little cost for generation?
Well, for a number of reasons. As you mentioned, I started in the power sector way back in 2000, in the Nigerian power sector, way back in 2006, working with the former Minister of Power, Professor Barton Arji. Back then, we were looking at developing the first IPP and actually the first distributed energy project in the country, if you think about it, because the way that was structured, it was completely off grid. It was looking at generation close to offtake, and it was looking at supplying a cluster of.
This is Abba, you're talking
This
to
is the ABBA IPP, geometric, yeah, the ABBA IPP. It was looking at supplying a cluster of commercial, industrial, and residential customers. But to your question around why large scale solar hasn't taken off, I mean, there are a number of impediments. One, I think the electricity sector as a whole and in its current state is not in a position to take on additional PPAs, agreements. And that's why we're seeing kind of the proliferation of more DERs. The sector is bankrupt. I think we're well aware there's a funding deficit. There's underinvestment in both transmission and distribution. So even if you do build more IPPs, solar IPPs, you'll need to ensure that you have adequate offtake, adequate infrastructure to deliver that energy. And today we don't have that. So I don't think it's the appropriate route to take until those issues are fixed. And those issues should be fixed. Because what any country looking to industrialize needs is both strong central grid infrastructure as well as complementary distributed energy initiatives. I know because the central grid is bankrupt, a number of folks are focusing on distributed, but I don't think that is the sole path to industrialization. We need both. And so I'd love to see continuation of the investment and the support in distributed generation. But I also think that we need to look at the central grid system and make sure we fix that and ensure that some of the distribution companies become bankable.
So when we look at the distribution sector, the key is revenue assurance. It hasn't quite gotten from power sent this way, and the money that's sent back the other way is lost 30% at best of its value. So there's thoughts around interconnected mini grids as a way to bring in fresh owners or fresh developers to come in and own a particular part of the sector using different models as embedded generation or mini grids or things of that nature. Why hasn't that? Well, I guess what's the process to take that off and scale it?
Yeah, I mentioned I started in 2006 with geometric, but I skipped my professional path and journey since then. So I think it's important that I disclose that I was actually part of the management team and shareholder of a utility and a Genco in Nigeria during the privatization as the CFO of CC Africa that purchased those assets. And I eventually became embedded in Abuja Disco and was a big part of implementing the turnaround plan. But it's so interesting you mention interconnected mini grids because when I say we, it was me. I'm wearing two hats now as RMI and former CFO of ADC. But ADC working together with RMI actually developed the business model um, to encourage and promote and incentivize interconnected mini grids.
Mm.
Policy had been there historically. I mean, the regulator issued that policy. I can't remember when, but it was in place for a while with not many people taking advantage of it. And that was because in the system, each of the stakeholders kind of saw themselves as competitors, right? So a utility owner or utility felt a DER developer was cannibalizing their franchise or taking away their good customers. And then developers saw the utilities as incompetent, not wanting to invest, not delivering on their obligations to customers, and not allowing people who had investments to step in. And so we actually created the contractual framework that incentivizes utilities to encourage and embrace DERs as part of a way for them to deliver on the obligations in their franchise. And we did that by looking at the commercial framework from the utilities perspective, but also from the DER developers perspective, and looking at a profit sharing mechanism that incentivizes the utility to bring in more DERs. And the DER developers actually welcome that because, quite frankly, I mean, you don't see a scaling of distributed without partnership with the utilities. Mm-hmm. The utilities have the data. The utilities own the customer. They are the supplier of last resort, even when the DER developer fails, right, to deliver. So you sort of want that kind of partnership as we look at different ways of serving customers. And we set that up. We piloted that, and it's so refreshing to come back to see that, really taking off. I think that even when you look at this iteration of the World Bank's investment in DERs, I mean, the first iteration was looking exclusively at off-grid. This iteration is looking at interconnected. And so we're seeing capital come in, we're seeing more capacity come in, and we're just seeing more projects being delivered. And I think that's a recipe for scaling. Would love to see it done more quickly. So there's still a bit of frustration into why don't we have, hundreds of these out there operating? But I do think in the early stages, as you're pioneering things, it takes longer. And then you get to a tipping point and you just see kind of things flow. So I'm hoping we're getting there.
Yeah, I am as well. So looking at the work you've done or you do at analytic finance, what does that actually mean in real terms? Like, how do you unlock or do you unlock capital for projects?
Yeah. I mean, catalytic finance is really our term, RMI's term, to describe how we want to leverage philanthropic and sort of donor funding in a more impactful way. So typically donor funding, so it's dispersed in many ways, but oftentimes it's dispersed to achieve a particular objective, and that is done, and then we sort of wait for the market. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes you see projects or initiatives stalled because we haven't made that linkage between the donor funding and the private sector, right? That we want to take on some of these projects. And so catalytic finance is our response to that. It's about how we leverage philanthropic capital to crowd in more capital from the private sector. And that is so critical if we're going to make any headway in meeting our energy demands and in supporting our adoption of clean energy. We all know that philanthropic capital is finite. Public sector capital is limited. So unless we bring in the private sector in a meaningful way, we're not going to get anywhere close to achieving our big ambitious goals here. And so this particular initiative is about, how we strengthen that linkage between donor and grant funding and private sector. What does that mean practically? So if we are working with donor funding to de-risk a project, and de-risking in the sense means all of the early stage work that's needed to make a project, right? A project can be an idea in someone's head. Someone needs to do techno-economic feasibility studies. Someone needs to do the resource validation. Someone needs to do the contractual framework with, in this case, the utilities. And someone needs to do a lot of the data gathering to validate a thesis around a project that we want to build and support making that project bankable. So we can do that part with philanthropic funding. But we want to do it in such a way that when that's done, we have private sector capital lined up to come in and invest in the project. So we make sure it's done. We've seen that in our experience thus far. We have a 14-to-1 kind of leverage ratio. So for every dollar in philanthropic capital that we put in, we bring about $14 million in private capital. And we've seen that globally. So this is our statistic globally, looking at the work that we do across emerging markets. So we want to see that here in Africa, and that's our big goal.
Are there countries you specifically work in, or is it just kind of broad based on the need?
In sub-Saharan Africa, we're in our program is focused on 5 countries. Nigeria and Ethiopia were our anchor countries when we came into the region 8 years ago. We're also expanding to Zambia, Kenya, and South Africa.
Interesting. How have you found working with? Do you work with the government? Is that as you kind of build that tripartite agreement?
So we work as an institution. We work with a number of different stakeholders. So yes, government is a critical stakeholder for us. And so our partners in Nigeria, for instance, are a number of the agencies here, Ministry of Power, REA is a big partner for us, and also GIAP on the funding side, the World Bank as well on the funding and implementation side. and a UK pact, FCDO,
Mhm.
and many others that I know I'm going to get in trouble for missing.
Please forgive her. No, awesome. So, I think one of the challenges the sector has undergone is regulation. Lack of regulation leads to lack of finance. You're not going to put money in a sector you're not sure you're going to use funds out. So, what are some of the tweaks if you had the important job of being a NERC chairman to be able to, or chairwoman, to be able to drive the sector forward to bring capital in?
Yeah, I will. Just going back to kind of the time I've spent in the sector, I, I mean, there was a time when regulation was a barrier, right? So I was there when NERC was set up in the first wave of commissioners, second wave of commissioners, and so on. And I feel like Nigeria in particular, regulation is no longer the impediment.
Mm.
I feel that over time, working together with, NERC working with the distribution companies through ANED, um, working with NBET and all of those teething issues we had during the early days post privatization. NERC actually took the approach of kind of let a thousand flowers bloom. If you want mini grid regulation, here it is. Interconnected mini grid, here it is. Franchising, here it is. Embedded generation, here it is. Willing buyer, willing seller, there you go. Because they didn't want it to be seen as the impediment for progress, right? And what we're seeing is that regulation is not the issue. The regulations are there, the policies are there. There are market issues that I think are more pertinent, issues that we spoke about earlier on in the interview around bankruptcy in the sector, um, the inadequate investments, the issues with the central grid. Until those are resolved, you're not going to see um, significant investments in distribution and transmission or large scale utility generation. So I don't think regulation is the issue. Beyond regulation, we now need to look at what we do as a sector to address those issues, what we do with the liabilities that sit on the DISCO's balance sheet, and so on and so forth. I know we're going off topic here. We could talk on and on about that. Um, but I just to your earlier question, I don't think regulation currently is the issue. I think it's more market forces.
So, but what about things like enforcement? The law's there, but people are not quite obeying the law as they should. That that could cause people not to put money in because they're not quite sure that everyone's playing the same game.
I mean, yeah, that might pose its challenges, but I do think um, there are investment opportunities in the sector. We need to be creative given the regulation that we have and kind of the flexibility that we have to implement innovation and innovative solutions in the sector. I think we as sector participants need to start thinking through what an investable mini utility could look like, right? So as long as those liabilities sit on the utility balance sheets, investors won't want to come into utilities, but utilities as a whole have very bankable pockets. Are there ways that we can work with utilities, the private sector, and developers to look at ways of carving out some of that, investing in the transmission and distribution network, and doing things piecemeal until we sort out the bigger problem. But I do think that the bigger problem needs to be solved. We can't run away from that. We can't ring fence, you know, our way out of this. We still need heavy investment and leadership in the central grid system. And I'm a true believer that if country wants to industrialize, I haven't seen any country that's industrialized with distributed energy. I do think you need both, right? And so we need to make sure we're focusing on both.
Yeah, so that's the conversation that we have here at the firm is if you don't have a grid, economies of scale can't kick in, and they're going to still have expensive power. So just from that point of view, 2 years ago, we went to the new act with state markets. um, and state markets have its advantages, but there's been conversations that capacity at the state level and potentially being able to fund a market could get in the way of actually making this solution rather than just something that we're going to try and it's not going to work.
Yeah. I was hoping you wouldn't ask that question. um, I think there were good intentions when the act included that, and I did mention earlier, like I think even with regulation, the push has been we don't want policy and regulation to be the impediment to the market taking off. We are desperate for solutions and innovation in the sector. And I think I would place this in that same bucket. We don't want regulation to be that impediment. So we do want to encourage states that are ready, states that are ready, right, to have their own regulators, electricity markets, etc. I think the caveat there is just that are ready. And I think that maybe in terms of implementation, I'm just surprised that it's being pushed so quickly. Um, I would have loved to see a bit more support, um, capacity building, and even readiness assessments, right? Because we do everyone a disservice if we kind of push things through too quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's sort of the way I see things, just from my point of view. I'm now in the US looking in, so I'm not heavily involved in the details. But I do think maybe perhaps it was a bit rushed. I thought maybe they would start with one or two.
States. Yeah. And I think it's probably one of those things where there was a bit of frustration with how things had been working over the past um over the past 10 or so years. So it was a chance to do something different. But is it going to get the results we want? I'm not sure.
I'm not sure.
The firm has been very active in into states and trying to create markets, but also being very cautious and saying you don't need a state market. You're not big enough. And you don't have the demand to go for a state market. Let's figure out the federal system. Um, one other point of view that I think we haven't quite touched on in the Nigerian power sector is that sometimes with the way the grid is structured, private investments can come in. People always pivot to now do ring plans or do creative approaches. If I recall from why solar projects haven't, or even wind hasn't come online, is because of ineffectiveness of the grid. In other countries that you've worked in, how's your grid structured? Is it kind of still the central model, or do they have regional grids?
So if I look at markets in sub-Saharan Africa, I'm trying to think, but I think all of the ones that I've had exposure to operate central grids, right? Whether it's South Africa, Namibia, Kenya, Ghana, um, etc. They all operate central grids, and it's the general mode that countries have adopted in looking at ways of addressing energy supply deficits. I think over time, right, there for countries that don't have kind of legacy systems built out, that aren't fully electrified and don't have and still have low electrification rates, there's an opportunity, right, to look at kind of advancements in technology and different ways of meeting the electrification needs of a country. So while central grid is critical especially for large industrial loads, I think we can be creative about how we take power to rural and peri-urban communities. Grid extension, in some cases, is not the least cost mode to electrify a population. Oftentimes, solar home system, an off-grid, mini-grid, or an interconnected mini-grid might be the solution. I think the beauty is that we now have technologies available to us that are affordable, that are easily accessible and easily deployable, right? To address those needs, to meet those needs. So it's important that we take advantage of that. We don't always need to look at the old way of doing things where it's a big power project in one location and dump that onto the transmission and then distribute that to where it's needed. Now we can look at different ways of bringing the source of power closer to the consumption and the demand. So I think we need to look at that. And then also, it's an interesting time for anyone involved in planning and grid design, right? Because even as you design your grids, you can do so in a way where everything isn't centralized. So if you have a system collapse, the whole country doesn't go down, right? You have in the US, everything it's regional, right? For instance, but I haven't worked in the US market. I just lived there. It's a regional market, right? So if Texas is down, New York is still thriving, right? Um, and so even as you look at planning and grid design, the technologies that we have, we can start looking creatively about how we kind of meet the needs of the country and start looking at kind of regional grid networks closer that bring the energy closer to the demand.
Okay. Last question, and I think I touched on this when I talked about revenue assurance. A bit controversial, but it's a Friday. I can get a little crazy. There's a perception that discos don't want to meter, they don't want to adopt technology because they like estimated billing and all of that. As the CFO, and I'm a very smart woman, is that really true, or is this just that the meters have not been available to get to customers?
So it depends on which disco. I can't speak for all discos, but so I will speak generally about the distribution sector. I wouldn't even speak about the one I was affiliated with, but I think in general, right? Distribution company as a company, right? The way they make money is by selling more energy, right? So they want to do everything they can to keep the lights on and keep supplying customers with the infrastructure that they have. So it's counterintuitive for a distribution company to say, I don't want a meter, because the meter is the accounting system for how you deliver, where you deliver, how you bill, and how you collect. I think the issue that we're seeing across the distribution sector is the inability to get access to financing, right? You need financing to invest in the distribution company. You need financing to purchase meters. You need financing to invest in the network. In the absence of that, right, it's hard to even account for where energy is being delivered. So there's a lot of theft in the system, and they're all struggling to figure out where the energy is going and who to bill and how to bill and who to collect from. And that's where you start to see some of the distrust between the counterparties, between customers and the distribution company, between the distribution company and Embed and the Gencos, etc. But it all starts with, do we have the revenue, sort of the tariffs that underpin the economics of the distribution company? Do we have the capital, access to the capital, long-term capital to invest in the distribution network? Do we have the time to make that investment, right? Or are we under pressure to start operating as if we've invested over 15 years today. So I think all of that kind of contributes to the state that we see the system, including the distribution company, the state that we see them in. So I think we need to address that. We need to make sure that they are bankable. We need to take care of those legacy liabilities. We need to provide access to long-term debt financing because we don't finance distribution investments, CapEx investments with equity. You finance that with debt.
Mm-mm.
So you need long-term debt investments, and then you need time, right? And ideally, right, I think hindsight is 2020, right? So we've spent so much on subsidies, but ideally, if we had kind of earmarked, and I do believe during the privatization, there was an envelope of funding earmarked for that, to sort of wean, sort of have a subsidy in the beginning, and then wean the discos off that subsidy over time. I think it was modeled after India's distribution privatization.
Mm-hmm.
A number of distribution companies worldwide that have been privatized have adopted this model, where there's a recognition that on day one, you can't start, forming at a certain level.
Mm-hmm.
So you need a subsidy, you need that subsidy to ramp down, and you need your performance, your investment, everything to start to improve such that you're operating more efficiently, you're reducing ATC&C losses, and you're getting to nirvana.
Unfortunately, we haven't quite hit nirvana yet, but I think the market is approaching a state of change with all the technologies that's currently coming in, with the fantastic work you guys are doing with all the discos, with some of the discos. I think there's a pathway where we could potentially get to a place where we now have degrees everywhere in the market to then hopefully deliver. Ije, thank you so much for coming, and we will see you soon. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
This podcast is brought to you by Next Year Capital, committed to driving conversations that shape Africa's energy future. Please subscribe, share, and stay tuned. Until next time, I am Emeka Okpukpara Jr., and this has been Connecting the Dots.